It's 12 o'clock in Hong Kong.
Bong. It's 3 o'clock in East Berlin. Bong. In Tel Aviv, it's 6:45.
I've always thought of George Carlin as the David Bowie of comedians. The way he evolved and changed his image over the years, how prolific he was with his output, the number of other artists he influenced, plus the overall longevity of this career where he was held in such reverence throughout. In pretty much every poll of comedians, Carlin sits in and around the top spot. His early material was so groundbreaking and provocative, it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court as part of an overall debate about freedom of speech. This was his infamous 7 dirty words routine, and we'll get onto that later. But what's the overall story behind Carlin and his legacy? Let's dig a little deeper. George Carlin started out as a disc jockey for the U.S. Air Force in the late 50s, early 60s, where he would do sketch comedy with a kind of offbeat, goofy sense of humor. He built up a decent enough reputation to get a morning show on a California radio station, eventually leading to making regular TV appearances, variety shows, and even playing Las Vegas. Carlin's act at this time was very accessible and mainstream, and he was successful enough to make a 6-figure income. But there was something stirring inside him. This was the 60s after all, and the fabric of society was changing very dramatically and very quickly. Plus, yeah, there were a lot of drugs going around. But perhaps the turning point in his career was when he became friends with Lenny Bruce, and he was present the night he was famously arrested for breaking obscenity laws. To provide a bit of background, Lenny Bruce's act focused on the absurdity of how words can be considered obscene, without taking into consideration the context that goes with them. This clearly left an impression on the young Carlin, and as we're about to find out, it also provided some beautiful foreshadowing. As the 70s rolled in, Carlin had fully embraced the counterculture movement. Gone were the smart suits and clean-cut look, and in came the long hair, beard, and t-shirt. He stopped doing his old routines involving crazy characters, such as newscasters or the hippy-dippy weatherman. This was a time of the Vietnam War, Watergate, civil rights, the women's movement, freedom of speech. He knew he could no longer be a mainstream comedian doing mainstream shows.
And what I started to do was to tell the audience, I'd say, listen, I don't belong in this place. You know what? This place should have closed 20 years ago. If I see Cesar Romero dance by one more time, I'm getting out of here. Dennis Morgan was up at the top throwing people down the stairs. This place is old-fashioned. I don't belong in these places. I want to go to the colleges where they'll understand me.
He was always anti-establishment inwardly, but now he was outwardly as well. And much like Lenny Bruce before him, he began closely examining the English language, why some words are considered bad, or only considered bad in certain circumstances, and how we define bad words in the first place. This was his acclaimed 7 dirty words routine, which was a list of words that Carlin concluded could never be used in TV or radio broadcast, and while performing this actually led to his arrest in 1972 for allegedly disturbing the peace. I'll never be able to do it justice by going through the whole thing verbatim, besides you can easily find it on YouTube anyway. Instead, here's the introduction for his HBO special, George Carlin at USC in 1977, which I really think hits the nail on the head.
Tonight you will see a performance usually seen only if you can get to the nightclubs, college campuses, and theaters where George Carlin is a constant sellout. A portion of Mr. Carlin's performance needs special introduction, at least for television. His target is language, how we use it and abuse it. Some would simply say that tonight's language is very strong. Others would say it goes beyond this and would find it vulgar. Aristophanes, Chaucer, and Shakespeare were vulgar too at times. Anyway, the segment is controversial. It provoked a legal proceeding at the Federal Communications Commission. In March of this year, I am happy to say, a federal court of appeals ruled in favor of Mr. Carlin's right to freedom of speech. Home Box Office intends to provide top programming to subscribers of widely different tastes. One proof of that has been their commitment to bring you the best in contemporary comedy. In the United States, in 1977, that includes George Carlin, one of this generation's philosophers of comedy, defining, reflecting, and refining the way we see our own time.
Carlin was now an icon on the American comedy scene. The more he examined American life, the more satirical and angry his persona became. After all, we were now heading into the 80s, and there was plenty to be angry about. The 80s saw the rise of American conservatism. Ronald Reagan, the fallout of the Vietnam War, the crack epidemic, mass commercialization of everyday life. It was a dark time for many people. And this seemed to be reflected in Carlin's voice, which became noticeably louder and coarse, displaying incredible verbal dexterity, but somehow maintaining a sort of roughness to it. Carlin knew all about the power of the written and spoken word, and he would scrutinize every aspect of American life based on the language people used, whether it be the government, Wall Street, religion, or just everyday slang.
There's a condition in combat, most people know about it. It's when a fighting person's nervous system has been stressed to its absolute peak and maximum, can't take any more input. The nervous system has either snapped or is about to snap. In the First World War, that condition was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language, 2 syllables, shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. That was 70 years ago. Then a whole generation went by, and the Second World War came along, and the very same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Fatigue is a nicer word than shock. Shell shock. Battle fatigue. Then we had the war in Korea, 1950. Madison Avenue was riding high by that time, and the very same combat condition was called operational exhaustion. Hey, we're up to 8 syllables now. And the humanity has been squeezed completely out of the phrase. It's totally sterile now. Operational exhaustion. Sounds like something that might happen to your car. Then, of course, came the war in Vietnam, which has only been over for about 16 or 17 years. And thanks to the lies and deceit surrounding that war, I guess it's no surprise that the very same condition was called post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables, but we've added a hyphen. And the pain is completely buried under jargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll bet you if we'd have still been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have gotten the attention they needed at the time. I'll bet you.
His act had taken on a whole new level, where for long portions he didn't even need a punchline, as he would mesmerize you with his use of vocabulary, voice intonations, and rhythm. It was like listening to a social studies lecture being delivered by a rock star. And Carlin was never one to be complacent. Between 1977 and 2008, on average, he released a new HBO special every 2 years. A lot of comedians rely on recycling the same act over the course of their career. But Carlin always kept up with the times, and was always ahead of the curve. George Carlin has influenced a staggering number of comedians, from Jerry Seinfeld to Chris Rock, Jon Stewart, Ricky Gervais, Bill Burr, Bill Maher, Sarah Silverman. The list goes on. But I think his influence is best captured by Louis C.K. when speaking about him in a tribute event.
And I was sitting in my car after the show just feeling like, this was all a big mistake. I'm not good enough. And I felt like my jokes were a trap. And I listened to a CD of George talking about comedy and the workshopping it and talking about it seriously. And the thing that blew me away about this fellow was that he just kept putting out specials. Every year there'd be a new George Carlin special, a new George Carlin album. They just kept coming, and each one was deeper than the next. And I just thought, how can he do that? And it made me literally cry that I could never do that. I was telling the same jokes for 15 years. So I'm listening, and they ask him, how do you do all this material? And I'm like, and I hear him, and he says, well, I just decided every year I'd be working on that year's special, and I'd do the special, and then I'd just chuck out the material, and I'd start again with nothing. And I thought, that's crazy.
Carlin died of heart complications in 2008, aged just 71. Mere months after releasing his last HBO special, It's Bad For You, which still holds up to this day as shocking, provocative, and thought-provoking. He was someone who continued ruffling feathers and rattling cages until the very end. In total, he released 15 HBO specials, 20 comedy albums, 6 books, plus dozens of TV and film appearances. One can only wonder what he would make of this world if he was still around today.